I'm going to make a confession to say that I did not know the work of Tarsila Damaral before I started this project. And she has been one of the greatest discoveries for me, along with Armando Reveron. And I believe that my exuberance for Tarsila, literally when the crate arrived at the Art Gallery of Ontario with the painting inside of it, I kissed it. I was so very pleased. I do believe that my exuberance, and hopefully this is what this project is all about, reinvigorates us to fall in love all over again with those who we know. So I think Valeria may have almost come around to enjoying Tarsila as much as I do. But I believe no one enjoys Tarsila more than Regina Teixeira de Barros, who holds an MA in art history from the University of Sao Paulo and specializes in 20th century art with a focus on Brazilian modernism. Regina teaches courses on modern art and museum studies at Faculdade Santa Marcelina in Sao Paulo and is a senior curator at Pinacoteca do Estado de Sao Paulo, where she has been working since 2003. Among the exhibitions she curated are Tarsila Viajante, Traveling Tarsila, Art in Brazil, A Story of Modernism at the Pinacoteca de Sao Paulo, and Constructive Art at the Pinacoteca. She coordinated the research team and edition of the Catalogue Raisonné Tarsila Damaral. Please welcome Regina.
Thank you, Georgiana. Good afternoon. Before I start my presentation, I would like to say I'm thrilled to be here in Crystal Bridges, and I want to thank Terra Foundation, the Crystal Bridges Museum, especially the organizers, this great team with, this great symposium. It's not easy to make everything work together. And of course, Georgiana, PJ, and Valeria. I would also like to congratulate for this amazing exhibition. Okay. So, Tarsila do Amaral was born on one of her father's coffee plantations in the state of São Paulo in 1886, 2 years before slavery was abolished in Brazil. Like other children of the so-called coffee aristocracy, she spent her childhood in the countryside where she experienced two very different worlds. Indoors, she had a very sophisticated education. She studied the piano and French literature, and everything was imported from France, from furniture to ribbons. Outdoors, she would make dolls from vegetation, ride horse-drawn carts, climb over gates, and she would hear ghost stories from former slaves. This sui generis education was to be very fruitful for her as a painter, particularly in the most productive period of her artistic career, from 1923 to 1930, which is the period of the landscapes we'll be seeing in a minute. In fact, although it is a very brief period, it can be divided into two different phases. The Pau-Brasil paintings from 1923 to 1927, which have a more constructive composition, and the anthropophagic paintings from 1928 to 1930, which are mostly oniric landscapes. So Tarsila moved to São Paulo in the mid-1910s and studied painting under conservative artists. In 1920, she left Brazil to continue her training in Paris, where she enrolled at Académie Julian and then worked in the studio of Émile Renard. At the time, although Tarsila was aware of avant-garde production, she was not interested in modern art. On her return to Brazil in June 1922, Tarsila met artists and intellectuals who had been involved in the Modern Art Week that had taken place a few months earlier. In a few words, the Modern Art Week was an event that happened in February 1922 in São Paulo's City Theatre. It was organized by a small circle of intellectuals and members of the local elite, and it was a multidisciplinary cultural movement advocating formal renewal of visual arts, literature, and music, as opposed to academic art, and they strongly suggested the use of themes from Brazilian culture. So back to Brazil, to Tarsila. So on her return to Brazil in June 1922, she met this group, the modernist group, which included Oswald de Andrade, the writer whom she would later marry. Tarsila's interaction with the modernist group significantly altered her perception of art, so when she went back to Paris in late 1922, by then already involved with Oswald de Andrade, she began to study under Cubist painters such as André Lotte, Alpert Glaise, but it was her experience with Fernand Léger that most profoundly influenced her own painting. The year of 1923 was one of great discoveries for Tarsila. She met the Franco-Swiss poet Blaise Cendrars, who introduced her to his circle of friends, which included Brancusi, Jean Cocteau, and Eric Satie, just to name a few. Surrounded by leading members of the Parisian avant-garde, Tarsila made several experiments in an attempt to forge her own identity as a painter. In a letter to her family, she wrote, quote, "I feel more and more Brazilian. I want to be the painter of my homeland. How grateful I am for spending my whole childhood in the countryside. Reminiscences from that time are now becoming precious for me. You must not think this Brazilian trend in art is frowned upon here. On the contrary, what people want here is for each to make her own contribution. Hence the success of Russian ballets, Japanese engravings, and black music. Paris has grown tired of Parisian art," end quote. Like other foreign artists who lived or studied in Paris, Tarsila realized that subject matter from her homeland could draw attention there. This discovery matched with the demands for art featuring Brazilian subjects that were being issued by the modernist group she had met in São Paulo. This only strengthened Tarsila's resolve. She was now sure of her own aims, to the point of telling the press shortly afterwards on arriving in Rio de Janeiro, "I am profoundly Brazilian, and I will study the taste and art of our people in the countryside, where I hope to learn from those who have not been corrupted by the academies," end quote. In early 1924, Blaise Cendrars visited Brazil for the first time. Tarsila and Oswald joined Cendrars and a group of modernists on a visit to Rio de Janeiro during Carnival, and then traveled to the historic towns of Minas Gerais during Holy Week. Both trips had a great impact on Tarsila, who declared that she had discovered Brazil in the simplicity of popular celebrations, in the paintings in churches, and in the decoration of houses and humble inns in the towns of Minas Gerais, where time had stood still since the 18th century gold rush fizzled out. Taking stock years later, Tarsila summarized her journey, quote, "In Minas Gerais, I found the colors I had loved as a child. Later, I was taught that they were ugly and hillbilly. I went along with the tittle-tattle of refined taste, but then I got my revenge on oppression by showing them in my paintings, purest blue, violet pink, bright yellow, verdant green, all in a more or less intensive degrees, depending on the white mix," end of quote. From then on, Tarsila plunged into her investigation of the visual representation of Brazilian identity, starting what is known as her Pau-Brasil series. In terms of subject matter, Tarsila's Pau-Brasil period is characterized by a preference for landscapes, both urban and rural. In terms of form, the predominant features are brightly contrasting colors, simplified figures, centralized framing of themes, and depth built by a succession of planes resulting in flattened pictorial space. Her urban scenes include Central Brazilian Railroad and the station. The foreground of both paintings feature a similar scene: a railroad with its tracks and wagons, level crossings, signals, and urban signage, and electricity poles. The absence of human figures and shadows, as well as the construction of the painting from a sequence of solid planes, highlight the rather unnatural, machine-like appearance of the symbols of modernity. Even in its plain setting, which features a church and cottages in rustic colors, the railway bridge in Central Brazilian Railroad crosses the canvas horizontally, dominating the painting as its main theme and interposing itself between two realities, vernacular on the background and modern Brazil in the foreground. In the station, the background comprises large buildings, including warehouses and a factory whose chimney stack determines the painting's mid-plane, this time vertically, between the station and the train sheds, showing a coherent imagery of metaphors of progress. Though it is not as well resolved in formal terms, a similar consistency can be found in São Paulo Gasô, in which an automobile, a gasoline pump, and the word gasô, probably short for gasoline, are the protagonists in a metropolis that is being modernized by leaps and bounds by both skyscrapers in the upper right corner and growing industrial activity as chimney stacks crop up along the city's skyline. São Paulo was one of the earliest representations of the city in a modern style. Once again, Tarsila populated the metropolis with icons of progress. A red gasoline pump and a blue electricity post stand out in the foreground. In the background, a tram, an iron bridge, a building under construction, and a billboard with numbers that nobody knows what they mean. But anyway, a billboard with numbers show that modernity has arrived. In this landscape, devoid of human figures or shadows, Tarsila produces a simplified portrayal of Anhangabaú Valley, which is crossed by a bridge, as you can see here, the Viaduto do Chá, in the city's downtown area. The painting is solidly structured by means of orthogonal elements. Horizontally, there is a beige ground and grass, the bridge's railings, the tram, a line of buildings, and a blue strip of sky. Vertically, there are the bridge's pillars, the three elements in the foreground, and the buildings to the left. The composition arranged on a grid basis, plus the symbols of modernity, are very typical of Léger, who became Tarsila's close friend. For him, the quality of a painting is determined by the variety contained therein. A good painting requires clusters of dissonant values. Quoting Léger, flat surfaces as opposed to modulated surfaces, volumetric figures opposed to the flat facades of houses, molded volumes of plumes of smoke opposed to active surfaces of architecture, pure flat tones opposed to gray modulated forms, or the reverse. End of quote. The grid system on which this painting is based is softened by a sinuous curve that runs through the valley's gardens and by the three circles included in the bottom half of the painting. In the foreground, the modulated tree canopy contrasts with the flatness of the other two figures. In the background, a lone palm tree, a mandatory icon of tropicality, accompanies stylized buildings framed at the top by a geometric shape so that the landscape remains visually confined within the painting, which is also very typical of Léger. In contrast to the uninhabited landscapes of São Paulo, Tarsila's Rio de Janeiro scenes include human figures, particularly black people, who are shown as docile and tame inhabitants. Both Carnaval and Madureira and Morro da Favela, which means favela hillside, depict the hillside occupied by the marginalized black community as a place that is replete with Brazilianness. The works imply that on the hillside, everyday life and popular celebrations take place more authentically without interference from the white population contaminated by European culture. Carnaval in Madureira is in many ways a very emblematic painting. The Eiffel Tower in the middle of the canvas, decorated with colorful flags and a zeppelin, is placed in a very Brazilian context. The symbol of Paris, inserted into the religious event of the race, as Oswald de Andrade would define Carnival, summarizes in an exemplary manner Tarsila's multiple education as a child. At the same time, it is a painting where you can easily recognize, again, Legé's theory of contrasts. In the rural landscapes, small villages, or perhaps laborer settlements on plantations, preserve a substratum of Brazilianness comparable to Rio's hillsides. Her papaya tree not only shows tropical vegetation, rustic homes, and the unhurried lives of women and children, but also exhibits an obvious equivalence in compositional terms to Morro da Favela. Likewise, this is very typical of Tarsila, a foreground with stones or a lake, a few plants, then a bridge or something looking like a curve, a hill, many times, and houses, and finally the sky. This is very typical of her. So likewise, in paintings such as Landscape with Bull and Angler, Tarsila uses vernacular colors for houses, intensely verdant greens for flora, and the purest blue for sky and lake. Unlike her urban scenes, rounded forms rather than straight angles structure rural landscapes. While orthogonal lines are in straight dialogue with urban and modern rationalism, the rounded forms of hills and rocks seem to mesh with the artist's idea of the countryside as an effective space untouched by foreign interference. In this sense, the countryside is shown as an ideal territory for the figuration of an imagery composed of the most genuine Brazilian culture. In 1927, Tarsila's painting began to change. Manacá, again we're coming back to the first panel, Manacá, which is the title of this work, can be considered a transition painting. The title refers to a native tree of the Atlantic rainforest whose flowers are born white, turn pink, and dye purple. On one hand, the color Tarsila uses to depict the natural cycle of this small tree, which is about 3 meters high, are the same she employs in the rural landscapes of the Pau-Brasil paintings. On the other hand, the clearly eroticized flora is characteristic of the anthropophagic landscapes that follow. Manacá is clearly an allegory of tropical exuberance of a highly fertile nature. In January 1928, when she gave Abapuru to her husband as a birthday present, he was so excited with what he saw that he called friends and decided to launch a movement. Abapuru, meaning in indigenous language, man who eats man, i.e. cannibals. This big-footed and small-headed pre-human creature, sided by a mandacaru, which is a sort of cactus typical of the northeast region of Brazil, standing like a huge candelabrum and a sun-dash flower, is a very synthetic and extremely powerful image that inspired Oswald to write the Anthropophagic Manifest, one of the most important, I'd say the most important, manifest in Brazilian modernism. In a few words, the manifest proposes a critique assimilation of European culture to be adapted in favor of the creation of genuine Brazilian art with local themes and colors. This strategy is similar to the one employed by cannibals who eat only the enemies they admire so that they can absorb the qualities they would like to have for themselves. According to the manifest, Brazilian identity lies in the matriarchal society of the indigenous people who lived there before the arrival of the Portuguese. The colonizers are identified with rationalist, male-dominant Western civilization that have hopelessly corrupted the community life and the deep bond indigenous people had with nature. In the lake, Tarsila's painting rescues an immemorial time and land, primitive and enchanted at the same time. In these landscapes, she reinvents nature, now depicting it with lush and erotic flora, placed in a wild territory with no geographic reference, only heaven and earth. These scenes are the home of hybrid species, a blend of plant and animal kingdoms, such as the cactus in Sunset. There are no straight lines left. On the contrary, there is a prevalence of curves that softens the landscape. The cadence of the arches in the sky and the warm colors of dusk turn the earth into a cozy homeland. In the forest, Tarsila depicts a nest of mysterious purplish eggs that are protected by a maternal tree. The womb-like earth nurtures a life to be of unknown creatures. The fertilized eggs symbolically refer to a new beginning for the creation of Brazilian art. Primitivism is no longer seen as an obstruction to the development of Brazilian culture as it used to be in the past. It is now perceived as a rich source of inspiration. The anthropophagic landscapes feature chimerical visions that appear either in Tarsila's dreams or blossom in her imagination of legends and superstitions she heard in her childhood. Once again, there are no references here to time nor place. One only knows it's night in this still and silent territory. These metaphysical scenes are powerful symbols of a mythical land and an unparalleled contribution that Tarsila made to the history of Brazilian, if not of Western modern art. Here, the waves and the curved horizon suggest that the whole world is comprised between a palm tree and a cactus, and the tiny hole, both in the middle of the painting and in the middle of nowhere, is surely a gateway to the core of Tarsila's unique land. Thank you.